She was a physics major with a genius-level IQ, a college student who looked entirely harmless. But behind that quiet demeanor hid a terrifying capacity for control. In the fall of 2000, two young roommates were executed in their own home, their bodies discarded like garbage in a local dumpster. It looked like a standard drug dispute. The real mastermind, however, wasn't a hardened enforcer. It was a 21-year-old girl who would later seduce a maximum security prison guard and orchestrate one of the most brazen escapes in modern American history. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Sarah Jo Pender was born in May 1979, growing up in the quiet suburbs of central Indiana. From a young age, it was clear her mind operated on an entirely different frequency. Teachers noted her exceptional intellect early on, and by the time she reached high school, she was consistently dominating her academic tracks. Her standardized test scores were off the charts, placing her IQ squarely in the genius category. She was the type of student who could absorb complex scientific theories with a casual glance at a chalkboard. This raw intellectual horsepower eventually earned her a spot at Purdue University. She enrolled as a physics major surrounded by some of the brightest minds in the state. Her trajectory seemed set in stone: a lucrative career in engineering, a comfortable life, the quintessential success story. But the structured, predictable environment of academia quickly lost its appeal. The equations and lab reports became suffocatingly mundane. She craved a different kind of stimulation, something raw, unpredictable, and dangerous. Pender began skipping classes. The transition wasn't a sudden, tragic collapse fueled by severe addiction, but a conscious, calculated drift away from the light. She realized that her intellect gave her a distinct advantage in environments where impulse usually ruled over logic. By her sophomore year, she had abandoned the lecture halls of Purdue entirely. She traded her physics textbooks for the gritty, smoke-filled basements and dimly lit houses of the Indianapolis underground. The local drug culture was a harsh, unforgiving ecosystem driven by methamphetamines, cocaine, and illicit pharmaceuticals. The heavy scent of stale cigarette smoke, the acrid chemical burn from makeshift labs, and the constant, paranoid hum of the trade became her new reality. For a brilliant college dropout, it was an unconventional playground. Pender embedded herself seamlessly into this world. She used her articulate speech, her charm, and her unassuming physical appearance to navigate a subculture that typically victimized young runaways. But she was never a victim. She was an apex predator disguised as a stray. People in that scene quickly learned that her quiet demeanor masked a hyper-aware operator. She didn't just participate in the debauchery, she observed it. She analyzed the desperate behaviors of users and the aggressive posturing of local dealers. She could read a room, assess vulnerabilities, and pivot her personality to match exactly what the person in front of her desired. It was a chillingly effective survival mechanism. Her psychological makeup was a dangerous cocktail of high cognitive ability, combined with a profound emotional detachment. She viewed the individuals around her not as friends or peers, but as chess pieces, variables in an equation she was constantly balancing to her favor. When she needed cash, she found a mark to provide it. When she needed shelter, she identified a target who would blindly open their doors. It was a parasitical existence, yet wrapped in such an attractive, intelligent package that her hosts rarely realized they were being manipulated until she had already drained them of their resources. Indianapolis in the year 2000 was a sprawling city grappling with a rising tide of narcotics, and Pender had positioned herself right at the center of a highly volatile orbit. She was a master strategist operating in a world of blunt instruments. All she needed now was a pawn, someone malleable, someone with a criminal pedigree who could act as the muscle while she pulled the strings from the shadows. That pawn was about to walk right into her life. Richard Edward Hull was everything Sarah Jo Pender was not. He was a convicted felon, a high school dropout with a lengthy rap sheet that included battery, theft, and a deeply entrenched substance abuse problem. Hull was a man driven by impulse and insecurity, a street-level operator who confused aggression with strength. They crossed paths in the summer of 2000 at a Fish concert. To Hull, Pender must have seemed like an easy mark, a young, attractive former college student drifting through the local music and drug scene. He assumed he was the predator, the experienced convict taking a naive girl under his wing. He was severely mistaken. Pender saw in Hull exactly what she needed, a blunt instrument. She required someone who could navigate the physical threats of the Indianapolis underworld while she handled the logistics. Hull was fiercely protective, easily manipulated, and desperately eager to prove his worth. She anchored herself to him, offering affection and validation, effectively turning him into her personal enforcer. By September 2000, the couple needed a place to live. The financial reality of their lifestyle had caught up with them. They found a cramped, single-story house on the south side of Indianapolis, specifically on Southern Avenue. The structure was unremarkable: faded siding, a sagging porch, and a claustrophobic interior that amplified every footstep and slammed door. It was cheap, isolated enough to avoid immediate police scrutiny, and entirely inadequate for 4 volatile personalities. Because they couldn't afford the rent alone, Hull and Pender moved in with another couple already entrenched in the city's narcotics trade. Andrew Cataldi, 24, and his girlfriend, 25-year-old Tricia Nordman. Cataldi and Nordman were not casual users. They were heavy hitters in the local methamphetamine ecosystem. Originally from Nevada, the pair were fugitives actively dodging felony warrants. They operated a lucrative mobile lab, manufacturing large quantities of meth and keeping significant amounts of cash and weapons on hand. Andrew was a high-strung, dominant personality who viewed himself as the apex of the household. Tricia was fiercely loyal to Andrew, matching his aggressive energy and remaining deeply suspicious of outsiders. Putting these 4 individuals under one roof was a recipe for catastrophe. The Southern Avenue house quickly morphed into a pressure cooker of chemical fumes and escalating paranoia. The air inside constantly hung heavy with the acrid, metallic stench of burning meth and stale sweat. Sleep was a rare commodity. The occupants stayed awake for days on end, pacing the cheap linoleum floors, peering through drawn blinds, and nursing their respective grievances. The primary source of friction was a severe power imbalance. Cataldi and Nordman held the capital. They were the ones bringing in large sums of money, funding the household, and paying the bills. Hull and Pender, by contrast, were perpetually broke, relying on Andrew's handouts and leftover product. For Richard Hull, a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in his tough guy persona, playing second fiddle to Andrew Cataldi was agonizing. Cataldi made no effort to hide his disdain. He routinely belittled Hull, mocking his inability to provide for Pender and treating him like an errand boy. He flaunted wads of cash and expensive drugs in front of Hull, asserting dominance at every opportunity. Tricia backed Andrew completely, often engaging in bitter shouting matches with Sarah. The house fractured into 2 hostile camps, separated by mere feet of thin drywall. While Hull seethed with visible, explosive anger, Pender's reaction was entirely internal. She absorbed the insults. She watched Cataldi count his cash. She noted where he kept his weapons. Rather than engage in screaming matches, Pender engaged in psychological warfare. In the dark of their bedroom, while the house buzzed with drug-induced anxiety, she would calmly deconstruct the daily humiliations for Hull. She highlighted Cataldi's disrespect. She fed Hull's bruised ego, quietly reinforcing the narrative that Andrew was a threat to their survival, and that as a man, Hull needed to take control. The dynamic was a textbook folie à deux, but fully weaponized by Pender's intellect. Hull was the gunpowder, steadily drying out in the heat of Andrew's constant bullying. Pender was the spark, waiting for the precise moment to ignite the charge. As October approached, the tension in the Southern Avenue house became physical. Doors were locked from the inside. Whispered conversations stopped the moment someone entered a room. The financial arrangement began to collapse as Cataldi threatened to kick Hull and Pender out onto the street, citing unpaid rent and stolen drugs. For Pender, losing this base of operations was unacceptable. It meant losing access to Cataldi's cash and product, and it meant returning to the vulnerability of the streets. The psychological grip she held over Hull tightened. She convinced him that a preemptive strike wasn't just an option, it was their only way out. They needed Cataldi's money, and they needed the house to themselves. The paranoia fueled by days of heavy methamphetamine abuse eroded whatever moral boundaries Hull had left. The four roommates were now trapped in a fatal standoff, circling each other in a filthy, chemical-soaked house, waiting for the first wrong move. October 24th, 2000, began like any other morning inside the Southern Avenue residence, steeped in a suffocating chemical-induced haze. The air inside the cramped house was stagnant, smelling faintly of sulfur and stale tobacco. Outside, a bitter Midwest chill had settled over Indianapolis, dropping the temperature into the low 40s, but inside, the atmosphere was boiling over. The financial standoff between the four roommates had finally reached a critical mass. Andrew Cataldi was done issuing warnings. He made it explicitly clear to Richard Hull and Sarah Jo Pender that their time was up. They owed him thousands of dollars for rent and missing narcotics, and if they could not produce the cash immediately, they would be thrown out onto the street. He enforced this ultimatum with a loaded pistol tucked into his waistband, a casual but potent reminder of the household's hierarchy. Hull was visibly unraveling. Days of heavy methamphetamine consumption combined with intense sleep deprivation had eroded his nervous system. He paced the narrow hallway, a bundle of raw, fraying nerves. But Pender remained entirely composed. She had anticipated this exact fracture. She had prepared for it. Just a few days prior, she had driven to a local Walmart, navigated the sporting goods section, and legally purchased a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. She had carried the heavy cardboard box to her car, driven it back to the house, and placed it directly into Hull's possession. It was the ultimate psychological catalyst. She had provided the means, and now, in the dim light of their bedroom, she provided the motive. As Hull trembled with a mixture of fear and drug-fueled rage, Pender methodically stripped away his hesitation. She outlined the reality of their situation. Cataldi was armed. Cataldi was dangerous. It was a matter of basic survival. Either they eliminate the threat, or the threat would eliminate them. She manipulated his protective instincts, framing the impending violence not as a choice, but as a tragic necessity to save her. By mid-afternoon, the house fell into a tense, uneasy quiet. Cataldi and Tricia Nordman were lounging in their bedroom, unaware that the dynamic had fatally shifted. Hull picked up the 12-gauge. The weapon weighed roughly 7 pounds, cold steel and hard synthetic stock. He chambered around. The heavy metallic clack of the pump-action mechanism echoed through the thin drywall of the small house. It was a sound that offered no ambiguity. He stepped out of his bedroom and crossed the few feet of cheap carpet separating the two rooms. He kicked open Cataldi's door. The violence was instantaneous, devoid of any grand confrontation or cinematic final words. Hull raised the barrel and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the confined space, a concussive shockwave that shattered the windows and blew the room into chaos. The heavy spray of buckshot struck Cataldi directly in the chest. He collapsed instantly, the sheer kinetic force throwing his body backward onto the mattress. Tricia Nordman barely had time to process the thunderous noise. She scrambled in sheer terror, desperately attempting to crawl away from the doorway. Hull pumped the action again, ejecting the spent, smoking casing onto the floor. He aimed at Nordman and fired. The second shot caught her in the torso, sending her crashing against the wall. The entire execution lasted less than 5 seconds. A ringing silence slammed down over the house, broken only by the sharp, acrid stench of burnt gunpowder and the rapid, shallow breathing of the shooter. Hull stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the absolute devastation he had just unleashed. His adrenaline spiked, sending his body into violent tremors as the reality of the double homicide washed over him. He dropped the shotgun. Pender stepped out of her room. She did not scream. She did not panic. She walked past her shaking boyfriend and stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, her eyes scanning the horrific scene. The sensory reality of the room was overwhelming. The metallic tang of fresh blood immediately began to overpower the smell of gunpowder. The walls, the mattress, and the floorboards were saturated. Where Hull saw a nightmare that would end his life, Pender saw a logistical puzzle that required immediate solving. She took absolute control. Her voice was steady as she issued her first set of commands. There was no time for shock. The bodies had to be moved, and the room had to be sanitized. Hull, entirely broken by his own actions, submitted to her direction like an obedient soldier. The physical labor of a cover-up is brutal, grueling work. A deceased human body becomes dead weight, an uncooperative, heavy mass that actively resists being moved. Cataldi and Nordman weighed well over 300 pounds combined. Pender directed Hull to drag their remains off the ruined mattress and onto a large, heavy-duty tarp she had procured. They bound the victims tightly, wrapping them in thick blankets to absorb the immense amount of biological fluid leaking onto the floor. They secured the makeshift shrouds with heavy electrical tape and cords, pulling the bindings as tight as possible to compress the packages. Once the remains were wrapped, the truly exhausting work began. For hours, they scrubbed the bedroom. Pender knelt on the stained carpet, utilizing harsh industrial bleach, towels, and trash bags. The chemical fumes from the cleaning agents burned their lungs, mixing nauseatingly with the lingering copper scent of the execution. They bagged up blood-soaked clothing, shattered personal items, and shell casings. Pender was meticulous, ensuring that any immediately visible trace of the slaughter was erased or concealed. As night fell, dropping the temperature back down into the freezing range, it was time to remove the primary evidence. They backed a borrowed truck up to the rear of the house. Struggling under the immense strain, their muscles burning from exhaustion, they hoisted the wrapped bodies out the back door and into the bed of the vehicle. Pender navigated the dark, quiet streets of the south side of Indianapolis. She had already selected the disposal site, a large commercial dumpster positioned in a poorly lit alleyway behind a nearby apartment complex, just a few miles from their residence. It was a calculated choice, an area with low foot traffic and infrequent sanitation pickups. Hull threw the transmission into park. The two of them climbed out into the biting wind. The scrape of the tarp against the metal bed of the truck was impossibly loud in the dead of night. They grabbed the ends of the heavy bundles, their boots slipping on the cold asphalt as they leveraged the remains over the high metal lip of the dumpster. The bodies fell into the darkness with a heavy, sickening thud, landing among discarded cardboard boxes and household trash. They tossed the garbage bags filled with bloody rags and the ruined mattress cover in right behind them. Pender closed the heavy plastic lid of the dumpster, sealing away the violence of the afternoon. They got back into the truck. Hull was completely drained, a hollow shell staring blankly through the windshield. Pender put the vehicle in drive and pulled out of the alley, her expression entirely neutral. She had eliminated her rivals, secured the house, and bound Richard Hull to her forever through the ultimate act of complicity. For Sarah Jo Pender, the problem was solved. IMPD homicide detectives swarmed the alleyway within minutes. Once the makeshift shrouds were cut open, the true scale of the violence was revealed. Andrew Cataldi and Tricia Nordman were identified through fingerprints. Both had sustained catastrophic chest and abdominal trauma from a 12-gauge shotgun at extremely close range. The immediate assumption among investigators pointed far away from the actual perpetrators. Cataldi was a known entity in the meth trade, a man carrying active warrants and substantial debt. The execution-style nature of the wounds, combined with the surgical, calculated concealment of the bodies, suggested professional enforcers. Detectives spent agonizing, frustrating days chasing phantom syndicates. They interviewed local suppliers and tracked down rival dealers, hitting a wall of silence. The community echo was profound. The South Side drug network essentially went underground overnight. Dealers locked their doors and users vanished into the woodwork, terrified that a violent turf war had just claimed its first 2 casualties. The local underground assumed it was cartel violence. The idea that a 21-year-old physics dropout and her volatile boyfriend were the architects of the slaughter simply did not register. The professional hit theory began to fray when detectives canvassed Cataldi's known associates, eventually leading them to the unassuming house on Southern Avenue. The property was abandoned. When crime scene technicians breached the front door, the heavy, caustic smell of industrial bleach hit them like a physical blow. Despite hours of meticulous scrubbing, the residence was a forensic goldmine. When technicians darkened the windows and applied luminol, the master bedroom illuminated like a map of the massacre. Blood splatter had soaked completely through the cheap carpet, seeping deep into the wooden floorboards and saturating the baseboards. The trajectory of the stains precisely matched the tight spread of a shotgun blast. A coordinated manhunt rapidly cornered Richard Hull and Sarah Jo Pender, who had fled to a neighboring county. The arrest triggered a fascinating display of psychological manipulation within the interrogation rooms. Separated by concrete walls, the two suspects presented an incredible contrast. Hull was actively unraveling, sweating heavily through the agonies of methamphetamine withdrawal. Pender's pulse, by comparison, barely elevated. She maintained an icy, impenetrable composure, strategically offering tears only when painting herself as a terrified hostage. She insisted to the detectives that her boyfriend had experienced a sudden, violent, psychotic break, forcing her to aid in the cleanup under the threat of death. Hull functioned exactly as she had conditioned him to. Deeply entrenched in his loyalty, he provided a full, frantic confession. He claimed sole responsibility for the double homicide, vehemently insisting his girlfriend had zero prior knowledge of the impending attack. He was falling on his sword, offering himself up to the state to ensure her freedom. But the investigators sensed a glaring discrepancy. Hull was a blunt, reactive instrument. He lacked the operational capacity and the foresight required to execute such a clean, methodical cover-up. The narrative completely collapsed when detectives recovered a receipt from a local Walmart. Days before the murders, Pender had walked into the sporting goods section and legally purchased the exact weapon used in the killings. Phone records and witness testimonies further eroded her portrait as a helpless bystander. Over the following months, isolated in a concrete county jail cell, the chemical fog finally lifted from Hull's mind. The realization was devastating. He saw that he was nothing more than a disposable asset, a weapon she had aimed and fired. The loyalty had always been entirely one-sided. Hull formally amended his confession, detailing exactly how Pender had manipulated his insecurities, purchased the firearm, and directed every single movement during the execution and subsequent disposal. In July 2002, Sarah Jo Pender faced a Marion County jury. The prosecution did not attempt to prove she pulled the trigger. Instead, they painted a much more terrifying portrait, that of a master architect. They detailed her staggering intellect, her emotional detachment, and her ability to weaponize a volatile addict. The defense fought desperately to resurrect the battered hostage narrative, but the physical evidence was insurmountable. The premeditated weapon purchase and her commanding role in the forensic cleanup negated any claim of innocence. The jury deliberated for just a few hours. Pender was found guilty of 2 counts of murder. The judge handed down a crushing, definitive sentence: 110 years in the Indiana Department of Correction. The 23-year-old mastermind was shackled and remanded to the Rockville Correctional Facility, a maximum security compound. To the homicide detectives, the prosecutors, and the families of the victims, the horrific saga was over. The threat had been neutralized behind layers of razor wire and reinforced steel doors. They believed they had permanently locked away the mastermind. They were entirely wrong. Rockville Correctional Facility was a fortress of razor wire, surveillance cameras, and heavy electronic locks housing Indiana's most dangerous female offenders. For a typical inmate facing a 110-year sentence, those concrete walls meant the absolute end of the line, a place to wither away in quiet despair. For Sarah Jo Pender, the compound was simply a new, complex puzzle waiting to be solved. She did not rebel against the guards. She did not fight with the other women. Instead, she adapted with terrifying efficiency. She became the model prisoner. She joined the facility's choir, actively participated in rehabilitative programs, and eventually earned a college degree behind bars. Her disciplinary record was immaculate. The prison administration viewed her as a tamed, rehabilitated success story. They completely failed to recognize her total compliance for what it truly was: camouflage. To orchestrate an escape from a maximum security compound, Pender needed a skeleton key. She found one in a seasoned correctional officer named Scott Spittler. Spittler walked the tiers projecting absolute authority, but beneath the heavy uniform, he was a man slowly drowning. He was a married father of 5, heavily burdened by crushing financial debt and severe marital discord. Pender's hyper-vigilant intellect easily identified his exhaustion and his bruised ego. Slowly, methodically, she began to dismantle his professional boundaries. She started with simple conversation. When Spittler worked the quiet, isolated shifts, Pender would stand by the bars and listen to his complaints about his wife. his lack of money, and his feelings of inadequacy. She played the empathetic confidant, offering him the validation and respect he desperately craved but lacked at home. This emotional reliance quickly mutated into a physical transaction. Spittler began smuggling in heavy contraband, cigarettes, cell phones, and illicit drugs, in exchange for brief sexual encounters in the facility's blind spots. He operated under the illusion that he was exploiting a vulnerable inmate. In reality, Pender was tightening a snare. By the summer of 2008, Spittler was completely compromised. Facing potential termination for unrelated workplace misconduct and desperate for an influx of cash, he was pushed to the brink. Pender offered him $15,000 to help her walk out the front gates. Spittler, blinded by a toxic mix of lust and financial panic, agreed to commit federal treason. But Pender knew Spittler could not drive her all the way to freedom. His absence from the facility would immediately trigger alarms. She needed a secondary extraction point. She reached out to Jamie Long, a former cellmate who had recently been paroled. Long was an older woman with a long history of severe substance abuse and a deep psychological dependency on Pender. During their time housed together, Pender had served as her fierce protector and counselor, shielding her from prison politics. Now she called in the debt. Using a smuggled prepay phone, Pender directed Long to rent a vehicle and wait at a designated drop zone just a few miles beyond the prison perimeter. The trap was perfectly set. August 4th, 2008. The tension inside Rockville was imperceptible to the warden, but deafening to Spittler. It was a thick, humid Monday morning. Pender was assigned to the facility's gymnasium for a routine cleaning detail. This was the blind spot they had chosen. Spittler arrived at the loading dock, driving a state-issued maintenance van. He unlocked the side doors and waited. Pender slipped out of her bright state-issued uniform and quickly pulled on a set of civilian clothes Spittler had smuggled in: baggy sweatpants, a dark shirt, and an oversized hoodie. She climbed into the back of the van, wedging herself into a tight, dark space beneath the floorboards and a pile of athletic equipment. Spittler put the vehicle in gear and drove toward the outer perimeter. He approached the main security checkpoint. His heart hammered aggressively against his ribs, sweat pooling under his collar. But the standard protocol played perfectly into their hands. As a trusted veteran officer driving an official state vehicle, the gate guards barely glanced at his cargo. They waved him through without a secondary inspection. The heavy steel gates slid open, and the van rolled out onto the rural highway. Just 2 miles down the road, Spittler pulled over into an abandoned parking lot. Jamie Long was waiting in a silver Chevrolet, the engine idling. Pender emerged from the back of the maintenance van, climbed into Long's passenger seat, and vanished into the heavy summer traffic. The entire extraction took less than 20 minutes. The fallout was catastrophic. During the afternoon head count, the alarms blared across Rockville. The facility went into immediate lockdown, but the damage was done. Investigators rapidly audited the surveillance tapes and zeroed in on Spittler. He broke within hours of his arrest, weeping in the stark interrogation room and detailing the entire humiliating plot. Jamie Long was apprehended days later after detectives tracked her rental car receipts and phone pings. Both accomplices were facing years in federal prison for their roles, but the mastermind was gone. The United States Marshals Service and the FBI launched a massive nationwide manhunt. Federal agents anticipated finding a desperate, cornered fugitive making critical, sloppy errors. Instead, they were hunting a ghost. Pender instantly severed all ties with her past. She did not contact her family. She did not reach out to former friends in the Indianapolis drug trade. She fled straight to Chicago, a sprawling metropolis of nearly 3 million people, and seamlessly integrated into the urban fabric. She permanently abandoned the name Sarah Jo Pender. She became Ashley Thompson. Her transformation was flawless. She dyed her hair dark, altered her style to fit the city's young professional crowd, and moved into an upscale apartment in a trendy North Side neighborhood. She did not hide in basements or dilapidated motels. She lived entirely out in the open. Ashley found steady employment working for a local contracting firm, confidently navigating human resources and payroll paperwork using a forged social security number. She made friends with her neighbors, attended crowded street festivals, and even began actively dating. To the residents of Chicago, she was just another intelligent, charismatic young woman starting a new chapter in the city. No one suspected they were sharing drinks and trading stories with a convicted double murderer actively hunted by the federal government. As months turned into a full year, the trail went completely cold. The FBI grew increasingly frustrated, hitting dead end after dead end. Pender's ability to blend into polite society was unprecedented for an escapee with a violent background. She wasn't just surviving on the run, she was thriving. Recognizing the unique psychological threat she posed, the marshals elevated her profile to the highest possible tier. In December 2008, Sarah Jo Pender was officially added to the elite 15 Most Wanted list. Her mugshot was broadcast across national television networks, plastered on highway billboards, and circulated through every major law enforcement database in the country. The cat-and-mouse game had reached its absolute peak. The authorities had limitless resources and satellite tracking, but Pender had the ultimate operational advantage. She looked exactly like everyone else. The unraveling of her perfect alias did not come from a sophisticated federal wiretap or an intricate undercover sting. It came from a television set. On December 20th, 2008, a national crime program broadcast a detailed segment profiling the Rockville escape. In a Chicago apartment building, a resident sat watching the screen and suddenly recognized the face of the polite, friendly neighbor next door. The tip was called in immediately. The FBI did not hesitate. Within hours, a heavily armed tactical team descended on the North Side complex. They established a rigid perimeter, locked down the street, and breached the unit. There was no shootout, no frantic attempt to flee. When federal agents stormed through the door, they found the fugitive entirely calm. She didn't bother to deny her identity or negotiate her surrender. The masquerade was simply over. She was swiftly transported back to Indiana. Because of her demonstrated ability to compromise facility staff and orchestrate complex logistics, the state took zero chances. Pender was transferred to the Indiana Women's Prison and placed in extreme solitary confinement. She was restricted to a tiny, heavily monitored cell for 23 hours a day, permanently stripped of the human interactions she so masterfully weaponized. Sarah Jo Pender remains isolated behind layers of reinforced concrete. The extreme security protocols serve a vital dual purpose, keeping her inside and keeping the rest of the world away from her. Her true weapon was never physical violence. It was an uncanny, predatory ability to locate a psychological fracture in another human being and tear it wide open. She convinced a seasoned guard to throw away his entire life simply to hold a door for her. Today, she sits in absolute silence. But her mind, her most terrifying asset, never stops working. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.